Welcome, everyone. My name is Linda Eaton, and I have the honor to serve on the board of TSA. TSA is actually looking for board members, and so if you're interested in nominating yourself, or if you want to nominate somebody else, but you need to check that they wish to be nominated, that would be really great. I can't tell you how much fun I've had being on the board, meeting people that I didn't know already, and it's just been wonderful. So I highly recommend the experience to you. So the title of this session is Needlework and Politics. And so I'm only going to, like all of the other sessions you've seen already, I'm only going to introduce the speakers very briefly, but you can find their bios, their full bios in the conference program. And I'll ask you that if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. There's a thing that says Q&A if you put your cursor at the bottom of the screen. That's an easier place for us to pick them up than in the chat box. So if you want to talk amongst yourselves, you can use the chat box, but I'm going to be using the Q&A for questions for all of the speakers. And we'll let all of the speakers speak first, and then we'll go back and do the questions at the end. So I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, who is Lyssa Stapleton, and she is the curator of the Cotsen collection in LA and the consulting curator for the Cotsen Traces collection at the Textile Museum in Washington, which I had a very quick look at, and it looks just fabulous. Her talk today is entitled Subversive Stitches, an Embroidered Portrait of Charles I in the Cotsen Textile Traces collection. So Lyssa, over to you.
Thank you all for being here today. I'm delighted to have an opportunity to share this piece with you. It's a wonderful piece from the Cotsen Textile Traces study collection. For those of you who are familiar with Lloyd Cotsen and his collections, the Textile Traces study collection is now part of George Washington University and the Textile Museum. This is T1084, a 17th century Stumpwork cushion. It's one of several 17th century embroideries in the Textile Traces collection, but it's the first to be analyzed in depth. Due to our time constraints, I won't be able to discuss materials and techniques today. Rather, I'll focus on the identification of figures on the pillow and what they mean within the political atmosphere of the mid-17th century, and I'll discuss the challenges of dating the pillow and identifying its maker. The 17th century was a politically turbulent time in England, marked by the execution of Charles I for treason, the Protectorate ruled by Oliver Cromwell, and the subsequent restoration of the monarchy in the person of Charles II. Stumpwork is an early 20th century term for raised and padded embroidery. During the 17th century, this technique was called raised or embossed work. And Stumpwork holds a rather remarkable place in the political history of the Stuart kings. The technique has roots in the padded ecclesiastical textiles of the 15th century and is a logical transition from the heavy floral and pastoral themes popular in Elizabethan tent stitch work. The popularity of Stumpwork, however, is short-lived, with an early date around 1630. It goes out of fashion by the end of the 17th century. In this way, it is singularly tied to the rule of the two British monarchs, Charles I, who ruled from 1625 to 1649, and Charles II, who ruled from 1660 to 1685. It was particularly popular after the death of Charles I, because along with the dissolution of the royal house came the dismissal of his professional staff, including embroiderers, musicians, and other artists. Many of these individuals gained employment in girls' schools teaching the domestic arts. The layout of the figures, animals, and structures in this piece is typical for the Stuart period. The central figures on the cushion are a man and woman standing in a tent with a young child between them. The embroidered squares stretching out behind them are the floor of a rather large space inside the tent and demonstrate the artist or designer's attempt at perspective. In the back of the tent is a cloth-covered table. Mid-range is a small dog, and the two adults and the child stand in the foreground. To the left, outside the tent, is a young man standing in front of a horse and holding a stick or cane, and to the right is a young woman. The background is filled with other flora, fauna, and architecture, some symbolic and some not. There is a castle in the upper right corner, a fish pond in the lower right, and the sun peeking out from behind the clouds above the tent. What I hoped to discover about this cushion was the identity of the figures and perhaps the embroiderer, and this required quite a bit of detective work. Let's begin with the relevant timeline and the world's shortest version of the history of Charles I. Charles I conflicted with the House of Commons throughout his reign. He was deeply religious, and his belief in the God-given right of the king to rule absolutely made him an authoritarian ruler and put him at odds with Parliament. The members of the House of Commons were mostly Puritans, while King Charles favored High Anglicanism, which was also known as the High Church Party, which many saw as too Catholic. This ultimately led to civil war and his capture and later conviction on the charge of high treason. He was beheaded in 1649. Several years of conflict followed, with Oliver Cromwell defeating any remaining royalist armies. Cromwell became Lord Protector of the Commonwealth in 1653 and died 5 years later. This period, with no king or queen, is called the Interregnum. After Cromwell's death, the monarchy was restored. This is known as the Restoration, and Charles II took the throne. Soon after the execution of Charles I, the cult of King Charles the Martyr began to form. Adherents were often strict royalists who objected to any form of government in England not led by a king or queen, and or followers of High Anglicanism, the form of religion favored by Charles I himself. While the United Kingdom was ruled by Oliver Cromwell, loyalty to Charles I or his heir was dangerous, and royalists were often arrested, executed, and their lands seized. Charles II was in exile for many years prior to the Restoration. The embroiderer of this cushion indicated the identity of the adult male, and by extension, the other people on the cushion, in a number of subtle ways. The first indicator that the characters portrayed here are a king and queen is the incorporation of the lion and unicorn into the picture. In the Cotsen cushion, they are in the lower left and upper right corners. These are symbols of the United Kingdom and appear in the full royal coat of arms. The lion symbolizes England and the unicorn Scotland. This combination of symbols was first used in 1503 when James VI of Scotland became James I of England. James was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and inherited the Scottish throne from her. He was also Elizabeth I's heir and became King of England after her death. He was the father of Charles I. This is the next piece of evidence. This is a detail of the male figure on the Cotsen cushion. What I want to point out to you is the star embroidered with silver-wrapped thread on his left shoulder. This is very clearly the breast star of the Order of the Garter. This is an order of chivalry founded by King Edward III in 1348. The star, which is worn pinned to the left breast of a cloak, is one of two pieces of regalia introduced in the 17th century by Charles I, and is actually a colorfully enameled brooch depicting the heraldic shield of St. George's Cross. And you can see the red cross embroidered there on his shoulder, although the color has faded to pink. The cross itself is encircled by an 8-pointed silver badge. The other Order of the Garter ornament created by Charles I is the riband, a 4-inch wide blue sash. The sash is now worn from the left shoulder to the right hip, but Charles I is often depicted with both the breast star that you see here and wearing the ribbon around his neck with a pendant of St. George. Oops, wrong way. There's the breast star. This is a well-known portrait of Charles I wearing the brooch and the riband of the Order of the Garter. He has his right hand on a hat, which is on top of a table, and gloves in his left. This painting is likely earlier than 1649, the date of his death. Portraits of him from that time, the time of his death, depict him with gray in his hair and beard and more age in his face. And you'll see one of those portraits in just a minute here. When placed side by side, these two images certainly resemble one another, although I realize the embroidered character seems significantly more cartoonish than the painted one. The lace collar, the hair, and the Van Dyke beard are all incredibly similar. The embroiderer has opted for a pattern on this figure's clothing, but the details of the two depictions, and particularly the star brooch, are very much the same. I'd like to quickly address the issue of Charles's bare head in the depiction on the cushion. There are many extant portraits of Charles I, most of which depict him bareheaded. There are also a few in which he wears a crown, and yet another group made around the time of his execution where he wears a hat. The hat was a political statement. He refused to remove it during his trial, since to do so would be a sign of respect towards his prosecutors. On the pillow, the embroiderer chose not to depict King Charles in the hat, but also chose not to have him wear a crown. Perhaps the hat would have made it too easy to identify the figure as Charles I, and the embroiderer had reason to not want it to be that obvious. Everything about this cushion dates it to the period of either Charles I or Charles II. Why couldn't this depict Charles II and Catherine of Braganza, his wife? Unlike his father, Charles II is usually depicted wearing a crown. Charles II and Catherine of Braganza had no living offspring, although Charles did have at least 14 illegitimate children. So if this were Charles II and his wife, who would the three children on the cushion be? It has been suggested to me that the dog in the tent might indicate that this is a depiction of Charles II, and that the dog is therefore a King Charles Spaniel. Charles II was a very avid dog breeder. However, dogs and other animals are so common in these embroideries that it isn't a strong piece of evidence for identifying this as Charles II rather than Charles I. And the resemblance between this depiction and extant paintings of Charles I make it a pretty sure identification of him. So if this cushion depicts Charles I, then we have, there's the dog, excuse me. Sorry, I didn't call up my circle before. So we have the king, Charles I, the queen, Henrietta Maria. That makes this Charles II as a boy. This is Mary, their oldest daughter. And this is James II, who, by the way, was Charles II's successor since he had no legitimate offspring. You may wonder why this boy child is wearing a dress, and that is because young male children between the ages of 2 and 8, until the ages of 2 and 8, wore dresses and gowns until they were breeched, that is, put in breeches for the first time. All right, so the next challenge was identifying the embroiderer. The 17th century was a time of great political upheaval, as I've said, and also a socially charged atmosphere preoccupied with a need to define femininity and what was acceptable behavior in women. Beginning in the Renaissance, embroidery became more and more associated with women and feminine behavior. However, increasingly, restrictions on a woman's ability to work for a living, including by doing needlework, came about during that time. Embroidery, however, continued to occupy the time and minds of women at home. In her book, Subversive Stitches, Embroidery and the Making of the Feminine, Rosika Parker calls this the domestication of embroidery, which is a perfect description of how it came to completely saturate the lives of women, particularly those of the upper and middle class in the 16th and 17th centuries. By the 17th century, fine needlework was such an important status symbol that men and women of the upwardly mobile merchant class felt it necessary to display the same types of embroidered and heavily embellished objects that would have been found in the homes of the nobility. Bed hangings, sheets, valances, carpets, cushions, gloves, coifs, sleeves, handkerchiefs, bags, book covers, shoes, gloves, and aprons could all be decorated with needlework. These objects served a dual purpose. They demonstrated the humility implied by the appearance of a woman bent to her needlework, and also these objects, elaborately embellished with gold, silver, pearls, and spangles, combined with the so-called leisure time needed to make them, were a powerful display of wealth. When I embarked on this project, I hoped to develop a strong argument in favor of a female maker for this cushion, a royalist woman who knew she could express her beliefs through her embroidery with very little risk that it would be looked upon as a political statement. What I discovered was that while this cushion could certainly have been created by a woman, it was just as likely to have been commissioned from a professional male embroiderer. As my research continues, I hope to be able to find further indicators about the pillow's maker. So needlework was a big part of a wealthy 17th century woman's life. And this is not to say that all women were good at needlework or enjoyed it, and there is some evidence that some rebelled against it and what it represented for a woman's social role. It would also be untrue to say that this acculturated focus on embroidery meant that women were ignorant of the world around them or unable to think critically about their role in society. The textile shown in this slide was worked by Mary Queen of Scots during her imprisonment in England by Elizabeth I. It is a wonderful example of how a woman could express both opinion and intent through needlework, the medium that was most available to her. This is one panel from a group mounted together after Mary's execution. The hanging, which is made up of a number of these panels, is now called the Marian hanging. Many of the panels in this hanging, and in others made up in the same fashion, illustrate Mary Stuart's only remaining avenue and power of resistance by the time she was Elizabeth's prisoner. The panel was made up when she was in the custody of George Talbot, the 6th Earl of Shrewsbury, and his wife, Bess of Hardwicke. That was between 1569 and 1585. Bess of Hardwicke worked this panel with Mary. The panel is made using counted thread embroidery, and like the rest of the work Mary created during this time, its motifs are allegorical and when combined have a specific meaning. This panel features a grapevine, most of which is bare of fruit, and a hand holding a knife. The cutting of the dead vines symbolize the unfruitful line of the royal family, namely Elizabeth, being cut away. The fruit-bearing branches represent Mary, who had already borne children. The Latin inscribed in the banner translates, "Virtue flourishes by wounding." Mary sent this panel to the Duke of Norfolk, who she hoped to marry. She was executed in 1586, several years after the textile was made. She was found guilty of taking part in an assassination plot against Elizabeth. Scholars who have closely examined the body of 16th and 17th century embroidery in museums and other collections have documented much about the personal thoughts and actions of individual makers. And still, there is much to be learned, particularly with regard to identifying the work of professional embroiderers and that of skilled women working at home. Embroidery was so much a part of the aesthetic landscape in the 17th century that expressing one's political beliefs through it seems inevitable. During the interregnum, royalists and supporters of the martyrdom of Charles I created and purchased devotional objects like these embroidered miniatures. These were all made after the execution of Charles I, and all but one are modeled on a 1641 etching by Wenceslaus Haller. The portrait at the top center is the most finely executed of the group. According to the Met, this portrait is embroidered with both silk and hair, possibly the hair of the king. The portraits at the four corners are based on the same etching by Haller, but the quality of the work varies greatly. The bottom center portrait is derived from another popular image of Charles I, also an etching by Wenceslaus Haller, which was made after his execution. And you can see the resemblance between that portrait and the portrayal of Charles on the cushion, minus the hat. The similarity of these portraits demonstrates their popularity, and the number of them still in existence 370 years later indicates that they were probably rather abundant in the 17th century. Were they produced by professional embroiderers and sold to royalists? Or was the design, like so many other popular designs of the period, embroidered by both professionals and by women at home? Going back to the cushion, there are a number of design elements that indicate it was likely made during the interregnum. It is more difficult to determine if it was made by a female royalist or commissioned from a professional embroiderer. Let's look at some of the royalist symbologies incorporated into the pillow. In the top left corner and the bottom right corner of the cushion are a leopard and stag. Both of these animals were popular with royalists, and both are used as supporters of the royal arms. That is to say, they were portrayed at the base of the royal coat of arms, holding it up. The stag was long associated with the Scottish monarchy and was a symbol of fidelity during the interregnum. The leopard is in the upper left, and the stag is in the lower right. In this image of the cushion, we see a caterpillar between the tent and the boy's knee, and in the border above the lion, there is a butterfly. These two symbols were also used by royalists during the interregnum to represent the monarchy. The caterpillar symbolizes Charles I, or the monarchy, as a creature that will be reborn as the butterfly, or Charles II. And it is potentially significant that these two symbols are on either side of the young man in the picture, who is likely Charles II. Now I must add a caveat to all of the symbology I've discussed previously. 17th century embroiderers used pre-drawn patterns. Designs could be taken from an available array of pre-drawn images published by professional design drawers or from pattern books. They might draw the patterns themselves or hire a pattern drawer. This embroidered picture also incorporates the lion and unicorn, as you can see in the two lower corners, as well as other symbols like the caterpillar and butterfly that I mentioned before. However, this picture may or may not depict royalty, and it is possible that the blue sash worn by the figure on the left and the hat in his hand were meant to identify him as Charles I, but there isn't a strong argument for that identification. And it may just be that the embroiderer was a royalist who chose to incorporate a lion and unicorn in an otherwise pastoral composition. To take a look at another comparative piece, though this one is not Stumpwork, this tapestry depicts King Charles I wearing a crown over on the right, and Henrietta Maria, along with Adam and Eve. Also included in the image are the lion and unicorn down here in the lower left, the stag and the leopard behind Charles, and butterflies, and a caterpillar. Patterns of all kinds were available to the discerning and not so discerning needlewomen of the 17th century. And the result is a densely decorated embroidery style that characterizes the period. The use of patterns is likely also the reason for the lack of scale in these embroideries. Rabbits are as large as trees and flowers as tall as buildings. And there are specific designs that are nearly ubiquitous in Stumpwork and other needlework pictures. These include castles or large houses in the background, the sun and clouds, caterpillars and butterflies, and various small animals and birds, as well as thistles and roses. I have not yet been able to solve the riddle of the cushion's maker, but I will continue my detective work and perhaps someday be able to better address that question. With regard to the identity of the people of the cushion on the cushion and its date, the design element that is unique is the order of the garter brooch on the male figure's left shoulder or breast. Together with other features typical in popular depictions of Charles I, like the Van Dyke beard and the flowing long hair, as well as the abundant symbols of the monarchy and those commonly used by royalists. Combined, this makes it highly likely that this cushion depicts Charles I and Henry Maria and 3 of their 7 surviving children. I was initially distracted by the number of children depicted on this cushion. And I tried to date it based on that. And that's a possibility. If the youngest child is James II, the cushion would have been made around 1635. By 1635, Charles's monarchy was already in financial trouble and religious conflicts were well established. The presence of several other emblems popular with royalists and the increasing popularity of Stumpwork during the interregnum makes it just as likely that this cushion was made after his death. And that's all I have today. Thank you all for attending.
Great. Thank you, Lyssa. I love the detailed shots that you had of that. They're just so beautiful to see. Okay, our second speaker today is my good friend, Andrea Pappas. Andrea had a research fellowship at Winterthur, and so I just want to give that a plug because we pay you to come and do research. And so we love textilians coming and doing research with us. So Andrea is the Associate Professor and Department Chair of Art and Art History at Santa Clara University in California. And her talk, which is based on some of the research that she did at Winterthur, is titled Embroidered Landscapes and Women's Hidden Knowledge of Nature in British North America. So over to you, Andrea.
So thank you very much to the organizers. I'm really honored to be in this kind of distinguished company, and this has been a really fascinating couple of days. I also want to thank Linda for supporting this project from its early stages, and I also want to acknowledge that I am broadcasting from the traditional territory of the Ohlone peoples here in California. My paper is part of a larger book project. This is the last chapter I have to complete. The book looks at landscape embroideries in terms of real landscapes, primarily from an environmental history, social history perspective. But I'm really digging into anything that might have been happening outside the window, so to speak, of the when women were making these things. So sometime around 1750, Mary Pickering finished her embroidered landscape picture. Pickering's needlework belongs to a genre of artworks produced by white women from wealthy families in the British Atlantic world. Sometimes measuring more than 4 feet wide, always brilliantly colored and elaborately framed, embroidered pictures rivaled paintings in both cost and cultural significance. Their pervasiveness in the households of wealthy Americans made them a prominent feature in colonial visual culture. Large embroidered pictures with this wide format hung over the fireplace mantle in the most important rooms in the house, hence they are called overmantels. After years of formal training, women in their late teens and early 20s stitched these in wool and silk while at finishing schools. Thus, while every woman learned to sew, only women from the elite sectors of colonial society produced large embroidered pictures in British North America. These date from a fairly narrow period around 1740 to 1770, and this is a time of great environmental and epistemological change. Overmantels are rich sources of evidence that extend and complicate our understanding of women's knowledge of nature and how they represented it in this period. I contend that paying attention to women's landscapes expands the body of evidence we have for women's interest in nature and the representations of it. Such examination allows us to begin uncovering hidden aspects of women's pursuit of knowledge in this period. Pickering's 3-foot-wide overmantel depicts many motifs commonly found in these works: the apple tree, the seated woman, the mounted hunters, the shepherd-shepherdess pair, and so forth. To audiences of our time, such repetition often marks these images as conventions, copies, or types devoid of documentary information. Close looking, however, reveals that this is not always the case. Although my larger project has chapters on agronomy, husbandry, gardening, and other topics, today I am just going to look at the butterflies. While I have looked at many other species in these textiles, solid identification of specific species or variety of animals and plants usually relies on knowing what the colors looked like in their own time. The recent conservation of Pickering's embroidered picture allowed me to pursue this line of research further, and so here you're looking at the back. These are composite of 2 photographs taken during the conservation of this textile. As you can see, like other embroiderers in this period, Pickering employed bright, highly saturated colors, and this can tell us something about her butterflies. And there are 3 of them. Pickering included 3 butterflies in her embroidery. Like other embroiderers, she employed different perspective systems, including hierarchical scale, which enlarges the relative sizes of important objects in the overall image. Her butterflies are huge. The butterfly next to the shepherdess is quite large when we compare it to her torso. This enlarged scale signals that the butterflies had a special significance for Pickering. Taking them one at a time, the butterfly at the upper left bears the small appendages on its hind wings that mark it unambiguously as a swallowtail. A look at the reverse reveals that Pickering employed a yellow-orange thread at the bottom end of the hind wings, and you see that here, as well as some blue. Taken together, the overall dark color and combination of blue, orange, and white spots on this butterfly strongly point to a specific species, the spicebush swallowtail. The spicebush swallowtail's habitat extends through eastern North America, including Salem, Massachusetts, where Pickering lived. These butterflies have a large wingspan, about 3 to 4 inches, so they're about as wide as the palm of your hand, and the low-flying habit of the spicebush distinguishes it from other species of swallowtails. Spicebush butterflies also tend to flock near ponds, making them easy to observe. These large butterflies were thus a striking feature of Pickering's local landscape. The butterfly near the seated woman has strong black outlining near the outer edges of the wings, peppered with white spots. A look at the reverse shows us that the original coloration was a bright yellow-orange. And again, this points to a specific species, in this case, the monarch butterfly. Male monarchs have thinner veins and less black pigmentation overall than do the females. Pickering carefully included the black spot on the hind wings, it's right there, that you see on the, that distinguishes the males. Like other embroiderers, she only sketchily indicated the delicate black veining on the wings, and she also left it out here altogether on the hind wing, and the effect is to emphasize this marker of the male sex. She took care to render the stripes on the abdomen of this butterfly, and she notably omitted the strongly marked side-to-side line on the hind wings that marks the monarch's smaller mimic, the viceroy butterfly. Both butterflies are common to North America, and Salem lies within their range. Like the spicebush, the monarch is a relatively large butterfly with a wingspan of about 4 inches. Monarchs are noted not just for their spectacular color, but for their annual migration between North America and Mexico, which annually produces clouds of butterflies in the sky. Pickering's local environment, including the large family farm, as well as the kitchen garden, would have provided her with ample opportunity to observe these insects. Her third butterfly sports a warm yellow underside, which is apparent on the back here, and a white eye spot on the forewing, which is barely visible here depending on how your resolution is. The colors and markings make this likely a half-size rendering of the orange sulfur butterfly or its close relative, the clouded sulfur butterfly. Both species feed on alfalfa, clover, and other members of the pea family. These alfalfas and clovers are just some of the imported plant species championed by progressive farmers, which included Pickering's father. These new crops made significant contributions to farm yields as they allowed farmers to stop letting fields lie fallow every fourth year or so. The Pickerings would have regularly seen these golden yellow butterflies fluttering over the fields seeded with these nitrogen-fixing plants. Moreover, these butterflies bear close watching as their caterpillars, if not controlled, become a serious threat to these key crops. So Pickering's interest here has two roots. These butterflies are beautiful, but they are also potentially damaging to a key component of farm productivity. Thus, it is not surprising that she included them among the species represented in her embroidery. Pickering's overmantle is unusual in its careful depiction of specific species of insects. Therefore, the specificity of these things and the inclusion of them in her embroidery demands an explanation. Notably, all three of these are native North American species, whose ranges do not extend to Europe. This means her rendering of butterflies comes from her observation of nature, close observation, as her pains to differentiate her monarch from the viceroy and to mark its sex demonstrate. Moreover, each species of butterfly she depicts has some feature that made it significant in the local environment. The spice bush's unique flying habit, the monarch's migration, and the orange sulfur's potential threat to food security. She cared enough to make the effort to present these butterflies for the informed viewer's inspection, implying the presence of such viewers in the audience for her works. Surely, she counted herself among them. Her embroidered butterflies thus stake a claim for her place in the discourses of natural science and natural knowledge taking place in her milieu. So really what we're talking about here is the politics of knowledge. Now that we know she was investigating nature and representing what she found, how do we connect it to other means of producing and representing natural knowledge? In other words, how can she be seen as part of a history? Pickering's work can be situated along at least two axes: transatlantic practices that produce knowledge of nature, which include botanizing, amateur natural science, and gardening, and two, we can situate them in a related web of transatlantic visual traditions for picturing knowledge of nature: botanical and entomological illustration, flower painting, landscape painting, and embroidery. Because of time constraints, I'm going to briefly trace only three of these intertwined strands which tie Pickering's renderings to butterflies to natural science, illustration, and gardening. First, in terms of natural science, Pickering worked her embroidery at a time when botany and similar investigations had become a popular pastime for both men and women. Some people thought that women were particularly suited to botanizing in their spare time. Cadwallader Colden, Surveyor General of the New York colony, writing to the Dutch botanist Gronovius in 1755 about his daughter Jane, opens his letter thus, quote, "I thought that botany is an amusement which may be made agreeable for the ladies who are often at a loss to fill up their time. Their natural curiosity and the pleasure they take in the beauty and variety of dress seems to fit them for it," end quote. Colden positions women's interest in nature as an extension of their interest in fashion, their observational skills perhaps honed over the tea table as they scrutinize each other's garments and maybe the latest fashion dolls from London. Cadwallader himself had pursued botany seriously, corresponding with prominent scientists in Europe and publishing a study of the plants near his home. Yet when it came to his daughter Jane, he reduced a serious study of nature to a refined amusement to fill up time. Jane, however, had other ideas. In the 4 years between 1752 and 1756, so she's working right around the time Mary's making this, she cataloged and illustrated nearly 350 species of plants in her local area, more than half of which her father had missed in his earlier study. Botanists and natural scientists on both sides of the Atlantic knew of her and her work, and today historians of science regard her as America's first woman botanist. Colden's engagement with botany aligns less with her father's ideas than it does with those of Eliza Haywood, a prolific and influential author. In 1748, Eliza Haywood, writing in the Female Spectator, described a different benefit accruing to women's study of nature. "There is nothing so profitable to the mind than the study of natural philosophy," end quote. Historians of science have found at least 9 women in British North America who seriously pursued knowledge of nature in the 18th century, and I'll just say this is kind of a growing area of pursuit of investigation. For example, Hannah English Williams collected many specimens of plants and butterflies from her South Carolina plantation between 1701 and 1713, sending them to James Pettiver, natural scientist, apothecary, and member of the Royal Society in London. Eliza Lucas, who ran her family's plantation, also in South Carolina, and who pioneered the cultivation of indigo in North America, took a serious interest in the systematic study of plants. However, we mostly know of these women who are investigating nature only through their appearance in the correspondence between men. Written records that these women may have kept have largely been lost. While scholars have looked at the relationship between textiles and the plant trade, embroidery largely drops out of this picture. The examination of plants and insects was aided by the proliferation of optical equipment in this period. Magnifying glasses in particular proved essential for the examination of the tiny details necessary to the study of botany and small creatures. Indeed, Haywood's fictional correspondent, Philo Naturae, addresses this explicitly, saying, quote, "As ladies frequently walk out into the country in little troops, if every one of them would take with her a magnifying glass, what a pretty emulation there would be among them to make fresh discoveries." Haywood, on the surface, positions women's interest in nature as a delightful competition, but her emphasis on fresh discoveries tells us what is at stake: new knowledge of nature and its workings. Pickering's presentation of these butterflies parallels Haywood's presentation of natural science, seeming to be merely decorative at first glance. But like Haywood's subversive fresh discoveries, Pickering's butterflies represent her engagement with the natural world and the flourishing field of natural science. Second, walks out into the country may have provided opportunities for close observation of nature, but kitchen gardens demanded it. Women largely managed kitchen gardens. The household depended on the kitchen garden for food and medicine. Gardeners thus had to pay attention to the plants, animals, and insects in it. Women needed to be able to accurately identify their plants and their uses. Stinging nettles are just fine in a suit, but nobody wants them in a skin lotion. Similarly, destructive insects and caterpillars had to be identified and removed from plants by hand. Microclimates can vary even over short distances, and the weather, of course, can vary widely from year to year. And these are two of the reasons women saved and exchanged seeds in order to diversify their gardens. Women certainly paid close attention to the plants and insects in their gardens, as the Diary of Mary Holyoke testifies. From 1760 onward, Holyoke recorded the success and failures in her garden over a period of almost 30 years, but such records are few and far between. Further, women who tracked their gardens in their diaries did not necessarily do so with other readers in mind. Theirs was a practical botany. Hence, embroidery can supplement these sources of information about women's engagement with nature. Third, knowledge produced as a result of investigating nature needs to be represented somehow for it to count as knowledge. Pickering presents these butterflies with their wings either in profile or spread in flight, the latter feeling enhanced by their diagonal orientation. And I love the way she seems to be being dive-bombed here. At the same time, the viewer is positioned directly above each butterfly, as if to hold it in the hand for close inspection. The artificial positioning of the butterfly helps us to identify it accurately. Botanical and entomological illustrations of the period employ similar visual tactics, presenting butterflies and other insects either flat or in profile, displaying distinctive wing shapes, colors, and markings. Both botanical illustrations and embroideries tend to present their plants as isolated specimens. The typical botanical or entomological presentation has little or no illusionistic space and depicts these very standardized views of the plant. With its very shallow space, the white page is a no place. It frees specimens from nature to take their place in the taxonomic systems then being developed by prominent figures such as Linnaeus, who did know about Jane Colden, actually. Embroideries overlap the genre of botanical illustration in visual culture. Both share the mix of scales in a single image as a strategy, but botanical illustration does this much more systematically. I am not trying to claim that embroidered species are the same as botanical illustrations, only that they share some features. The pictorial strategies of embroidery diverge from botanical illustration because the embroideries are primarily landscapes, which operate as standalone images. In contrast, illustrations appear in a fixed sequence and function in symbiosis with their accompanying descriptive texts. The accuracy of Pickering's renderings, their visual features, and the widespread interest in natural science and botanizing as a recreation invite us to think about embroidery in relation to these botanical or entomological illustrations. Embroiderers have used such illustrations as sources of motifs and patterns, of course, and so, for example, Maria Sibylla Marion's Neue excuse me, Neue Blumenbuch at right, which contains over 100 plates of flowers, function both as botanical illustrations and as patterns for embroidery, and specifically for her embroidery students. However, Pickering's butterflies embody a relationship between embroidery and illustration that goes beyond positioning embroiderers only as copyists or consumers of botanical illustrations. In sum, Jane Colden and Mary Pickering represented their knowledge of nature in different ways, using ink on paper or wool on canvas. Their efforts grew in a larger field of such representations of the knowledge of nature. Men and women alike captured their natural knowledge in print and image, in ink, paper, and canvas, and paint. Women additionally deployed silk and wool. Pickering's butterflies then sit at the intersection of gender and the production of knowledge of nature in British North America. She has carefully observed her butterflies, but rather than recording them as in pseudo-scientific, or I don't want to say pseudo, but quasi-scientific or proto-scientific manner, she pictures them in thread. Just as Haywood cloaked her promotion of science to women in the guise of female piety and virtue, Pickering's butterflies appear as embroidery, a medium historically associated with that female virtue. Pickering left no other records of her knowledge of nature, yet it is unlikely that her examination of nature stopped at just 3 butterflies. Her embroidery is the only evidence we have of her interest in nature and its workings. However, I hope that I have shown that careful attention to her embroidered landscapes allows her to take her place, small as it may be, in the larger history of women and their manifold relationships to nature. Mary Pickering's knowledge is hidden no more. Thank you. And I would just like to say that I really would like to know about any more embroideries like this in private hands. Tracking these can be a little tricky. And I'm also interested in, for another chapter, in finding English 18th century embroideries that have accurate depictions of strawberries in them. So thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. That was fabulous. And what a treat to be able to see the back of that wonderful, wonderful piece.
Isn't that wonderful? I was just, the textile is still in the hands of the family.
Yeah, it's great. That's wonderful. And so, thank you. Our third speaker for this session is another friend of mine, Suzanne McDowell. So Suzanne is an independent researcher, hand weaver, and a former museum curator. And her talk is titled Voting with My Needle, a Whitework quilt circa 1860 from Tennessee. So over to you.
Okay, well, I'm glad to be here tonight. It's an honor to be included in this group and in this virtual symposium. And I want to extend my thanks also to the McMinn County Living Heritage Museum located in Athens, Tennessee. And Athens, Tennessee is about 100 miles from Nashville going east. Over many years, they have allowed me the opportunity to study, document, and share information about their large quilt collection, parts of which are on the Quilt Index. It's a great regional museum, and when you are in that area of Tennessee, I encourage you to stop by. I'm particularly drawn to the study of material objects in the form of quilts and hand-woven coverlets. And while pondering how best to share why I find these textile objects so intriguing, I read a statement by Dr. Torrin Gatson that appeared recently in the journal published by the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And I quote, "The true power in an object is its ability to tell a story and, on occasion, capture the voice of an otherwise historically invisible person." So my presentation is what I found through a closer examination of an object, the story the object helps tell, and the invisible people who created it. Whitework quilts are notoriously hard to photograph, and this one is no different. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to be talking about Southern whitework quilts with these common characteristics. They're made of cotton, and they are all white fabric. There are two layers that are quilted together with closely spaced or dense quilting. They're embellished with stuffed or filled motifs, often referred to now as trapunto. And whitework quilts were most popular in the United States from the late 18th to the mid-19th century. Well, why would somebody make a whitework quilt? Well, when this quilt was acquired in 1985 by the McMinn County Museum, the donor family speculated that it was a wedding gift presented to relatives in the early 1900s. And many quilt publications often attribute whitework quilts as part of a bride's trousseau prior to her marriage. But the 1900 date seemed rather late. And quilt scholarship today has begun to emphasize the historical context of whitework quilts. So I took a closer look at the object. In the center, on the left image, in the center of the quilt is an equilateral triangle, and the triangle contains a circle, and inside the circle is a six-pointed star and star rays. To the right and the left of the triangle, in the image on the right, is a column, a mirror image column. The top of the column is round and steps are at its base, and a meandering floral vine wraps around it. Again, in a mirror image, left and right, top and bottom, is a large shielded eagle. The eagle holds 6 arrows in one talon and clutches the vine in the other. Beside the eagle, at the top and the bottom, is a footed goblet. The meandering floral vine finishes the outer quilt border. The quilt is large, measuring 77 inches by 89 inches, and quilting is at 12 stitches to the inch, with less than 1/4 of an inch between quilting lines, creating a beautifully stippled surface. On the quilt top are some stuffed initials, Belle Everett and Susan M. Smith, 1860. At least that's the manner in which we first recorded the names. Knowing it would be fruitless at this point to search on Ancestry for Susan M. Smith, the museum curator and I began to look for the name Belle Everett about 1860 in Tennessee. Fortunately, at this point, 2 important conversations happened. First, the curator, Mary Alton, contacted several of her Tennessee history-minded friends, and one told her to recall a bit of Tennessee history. Our story begins in Nashville, Tennessee. An early outpost, Fort Nashborough, had been established in the 1780s when pioneers began pouring into the newly opened territory west. Many came to claim land grants that were in part payment to Revolutionary War veterans. With growth, Nashborough's name changed to Nashville, and you see it there in the red circle. And its location along the Cumberland River ensured that it grew into the mercantile center for shipping and receiving goods throughout the Mid-South. In 1843, Nashville became the permanent capital of Tennessee, and it is where the 1860 era politics enters our story. I know you're all excited to hear a political story right now. Nashville is where John Bell was born in 1796, the same year that Tennessee became a state. In 1814, Bell graduated from Cumberland College. Today, it's known as the George Peabody College of Vanderbilt University. He then set up a law practice outside of Nashville in nearby Franklin, Tennessee. Bell became one of Tennessee's leading politicians. He served terms in both the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, and also served as a Secretary of War in 1841. Although he was a slaveholder, Bell opposed opening new territories to slavery, And in 1854, he came out in opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. That's when John Bell earned his reputation as a defender of the Union. Edward Everett was born 2 years before Bell in Boston, Massachusetts. Educated in Germany, Everett is the first American to ever receive a PhD. He served as governor of Massachusetts, as a president of Harvard, and also as a Secretary of State. Everett was considered the greatest public speaker of his time. In 1863, he was asked to give a speech at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, to dedicate a new memorial to Civil War soldiers. You may never have heard of Everett or his speech because another speaker that day, Abraham Lincoln, also gave a few remarks, and those are forever known as the Gettysburg Address. The main point I want to make about these two men is that they had known each other for years from working together in federal government, and they were paired for the 1860 presidential election. Throughout the 1850s, the issue of slavery had dominated national politics. Suffice it to say that by the 1860 political election, the issue led to a splintering of parties. The Republican Party candidate was Abraham Lincoln, and their platform was seen as anti-slavery. The Democrats split into two factions, a northern group headed by Stephen Douglas, who supported popular sovereignty, or let the people of each state decide what they wanted. The southern group was headed by John Breckinridge of Kentucky, and they wanted federal protection for slavery. And then there was the newly formed Constitutional Union Party, represented by Bell and Everett. That party wanted to avoid secession and the slavery question, so their motto was no North, no South, no East, no West, nothing but the Union. The Republican Party, represented by Abraham Lincoln, beat out the other two parties handily. Bell carried only 3 southern states, his home state of Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia. And of course, what followed this election was the Civil War. But turning from politics, I wanted to know, who was this Smith woman? Well, remember when I mentioned that 2 good things came from the curator's casual inquiry to some of her Tennessee friends? In addition to the Bell and Everett political story, it was suggested that perhaps the M stood for the McGavock family of Nashville, Tennessee, an extremely influential and early pioneer family who were, by the way, neighbors and friends of John Bell. An ancestry search found Susan Elizabeth McGavock, born in 1829, who married a William Henry Smith in 1850. So I dove into Susan's family connections, the Hardings and the McGavocks. Susan's maternal grandparents were John Harding and Susanna Shute Harding. They came from Virginia to Tennessee about 1798 when John purchased a 250-acre farm outside of Nashville that he called Belle Meade. John built a federal-style brick home, and the Belle Meade plantation grew to over 1,200. Mother was born at Belle Meade in 1807, and in 1823, Amanda married Frank McGavock. Susan's paternal line follows the McGavocks. Around the 1750s, James and Mary Cloyd McGavock immigrated from Northern Ireland to Pennsylvania, like many of their Ulster Scots neighbors. They left Philadelphia to settle on the southwestern Virginia frontier, where they raised 10 children, 5 girls and 5 boys. Sometime in the 1780s, John and Mary decided to send their 5 sons west to newly claimed open lands in the Cumberland Valley and beyond. One son, David, Susan's grandfather, was a surveyor. So he was in a position to our land and Nashville. In 1798, David married Elizabeth McDowell, the daughter of a prominent and influential Virginia family. Their family of 6 sons and 1 daughter included Susan's father, Francis Preston McGavock. And in 1823, Francis, called Frank, married Amanda Harding, and they set up their household at Cliff Lawn on land adjoining Belmead Plantation. In 1829, their daughter, Susan, was born. To date, no diary or papers belonging to Susan have been found other than her will. However, some assumptions can be made about her early life based on what we know about the upper-class McGavock and Harding families. Both families were wealthy, owners of extensive fertile lands, and both had married well. Both families owned enslaved Black Americans. In fact, John Harding was the 3rd largest slaveholder in Tennessee before his death. Both families prized education. Susan's early education was likely at home with her siblings. Later, she possibly attended the Nashville Female Academy, where her grandfather John was an investor and her mother Amanda had received her education. The academy courses included painting, drawing, handwork, and music, as well as reading, writing, and classical education. Both families were politically connected and very active in their communities, their county, and their state. And both adhered to 19th century norms of separate spheres of influence, or what is described historically as an era of the cult of true womanhood. Women's activities centered on all things of the home, running an efficient household and raising their children as educated, pious, and socially trained for their separate sphere. A daughter's education was to be put to use only in the home and not in the public sphere or the political sphere, open only to the men. Women had no voting rights, indeed, hardly any power outside of their home. Men occupied the public sphere where they assumed active political roles and made economic decisions and oversaw the growth of their landed properties and families. The McGavock and Harding men were fully immersed in Nashville's banking and educational institutions, religious, political, and fraternal organizations, and well acquainted with all of the prosperous merchants. I also don't fully know how Susan met William Henry Smith, but it could be that they were introduced by a mutual acquaintance, a friend, or a neighbor like John Bell. Henry Smith and Bell were both graduates of Cumberland College. After graduating, Henry joined the growing Nashville merchant community. John Bell's connections with the Nashville mercantile community came through his marriage to Jane Irwin Yateman, who was one of the wealthiest widows in the city of Nashville. Both Smith and Bell also may have been members of the same Masonic organizations in Nashville. So what is Susan M. Smith sharing with us in this Whitework quilt? Here's my current interpretation. On the Quilt Index website, in an essay entitled American Quilts of Patriotism and Political Commentary, author Amanda Grace Sikarsky notes that, and I'm going to quote, "There is ample evidence to suggest that quilts were a popular place for political and patriotic rhetoric. From the birth of the Republic throughout the antebellum period, the American eagle of the Great Seal was the most popular patriotic motif. And the eagle that we see here was first designed in 1782 by Charles Thompson, a secretary of the Continental Congress, and was to represent the United States' strength, unity, and independence, all of which seemed in jeopardy before the 1860 election. Along the Blue Ridge Parkway in Haywood County near my home is a large stone monument erected in 1938, and you see it in your upper right corner. The marker celebrates the universality of the Masons, one of the oldest and the largest fraternal organizations in the world. The stone triangle with the circle that you see in the center there resembles closely the Whitework's quilt central triangle that contains the circle and the star. What I do know is that John Bell was a member of Hiram Lodge number 7 in Franklin, Tennessee, when he began to practice law. Was Henry Smith a member of the same brotherhood? You'll also notice that I found at the monument columns, stone columns, quite compatible and similar to the column on the Whitework quilt, except for the vine flowing around. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote was passed 60 years after Susan McGavock Smith had this whitework embellished with significant names and dates. But some questions still remain. Did she make the quilt before her 1850 marriage to William Henry Smith as part of her trousseau? Well, certainly the tradition of whitework quilts would have been within the time frame and the cultural expectations of her young adulthood. Did she make it all by herself? I think it very likely that there are many more invisible people, meaning the enslaved people from Cliff Lawn and Belle Meade, who likely had a very physical hand in stitching this quilt under Susan's directions. Susan's married name and the date 1860 is certainly prominent on the quilt. But if you look closer at the names Bell and Everett, Everett is spelled with only one T. Is that a misspelling, or was this whitework quilt finished and used before the 1860 election season and only embellished later, and there wasn't room to add that extra T? I began this presentation with Dr. Torrin Gatson's statement about how the true power in an object is its ability to tell a story and, on occasion, capture the voice of an otherwise historically invisible person. There are still some unanswered questions to this story and some other invisible people to discover. But there is indeed evidence of how this whitework quilt did capture the voice of an otherwise historically invisible woman, Susan M. Smith, who voted with her needle. Thank you.
Thank you. That was absolutely fabulous. What an interesting quilt. And I know how hard those are to photograph. Such a nightmare. One of our students described it as taking a photograph of a polar bear in a snowstorm.
Yes.
Okay, so our final speaker for this session is Soledad Munoz. Soledad is an artist born in Canada, raised in Chile, and she's currently based in Toronto. So she gets around. The title of her paper is La Arpilleras, Nuestros Desaparecidos. The Arpilleros are disappeared. And so this is a very much more contemporary political thing to some of our previous speakers. So Soledad, take it away.
So hello, everyone. My name is Soledad Munoz, and I am one of the many Chileans born in my family's exile because of Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship from 1973 to 1991. Although I was born in Toronto, I grew up in Rancagua, Chile. I started conceptualizing this paper while studying in Chicago and experiencing a country that, generally speaking, has naturalized neoliberalism as part of their national identity and paired it to an idea of democracy. Anything outside of this hegemonic thought is viewed as idealistic or communist by the general public. Many times while in school in the US, I was told, Soledad, you cannot fight neoliberalism. This aggression was not protected under any harassment or discrimination policies, although my family was persecuted, incarcerated, and tortured, and thousands were disappeared or killed due to the installment of a dictatorship that forcefully promoted this ideology. The first iteration of this paper was called Las Arpilleras, Nuestros, Desaparecidos, and I talked about the School of Economics of the University of Chicago and a group of Chilean graduates dubbed the Chicago Boys as the ideological pillars of the free market reforms installed in Chile via coup on September 11th of 1973, in relation to the arpilleras, that are textile works of narrative imagery created as a reaction to the dictatorship that followed the coup. And since our books were burned, our ancestors disappeared, killed, or too traumatized to speak, the content depicted in the arpilleras was a way of recovering the gestures of those silenced by the teachings of the previous mentioned institution. That being said, I also argued that other forms of academic work about these textiles, mostly written by European and North American scholars, instead of disrupting the colonizer-colonized dynamic, appropriated our resistance and used it as cultural capital for the neoliberal institutions that we were fighting in the first place, therefore perpetuating our oppression. Some of these works are even published by the University of Chicago Press. But then in October 2019, millions of Chileans took the streets to fight against the neoliberal policies installed by the Chicago Boys in the 70s and tied to a constitution in 1981. As a response to this, the current right-wing president, Sebastián Piñera, declared war to his own country and sent the military to the streets. Dozens of Chileans died, hundreds of them lost their eyes, and thousands suffered sexual violence while detained. Yet I did not see any of this in Canadian national media. Therefore, to have a platform like this and not pass the mic feels wrong. So I got in contact with my friends Lula Almeida, who's a writer and host of Alo Solte and many other known feminist podcasts in Chile, and Amaranta Espinosa, the founder of Colectiva Borda Sin Patrón, and a textile artist dedicated to pedagogical practices in collective gatherings and women's prisons. From our collaboration and the conversations that we had with our ancestors and peers, a new project was called La Parte de Atrás de la Arpillera, for which we asked our arpillera and embroidery making friends to tell us about their lives, practice, and anything that they would like to communicate to the audiences of the Textile Society of America's Biennial. In doing this, we are hoping to resist colonial and ethnographic approaches to research, move towards a culture of consent, and combat the anonymity of the arpilleras, of the arpilleristas, whose names have been replaced for those of collectors and collections around the world. Okay, so now I'm going to play the video if you want to go to your link. But there we go.
Las arpilleras fueron prohibidas, eran peligrosas para el gobierno chileno, para la dictadura chilena. Entonces nosotros teníamos también que tener la precaución de no poner firma ni nada, sino que nosotros por detrás de la arpillera poníamos una bolsita y ahí poníamos una carta que relataba, hacía un relato de lo que significaba esa arpillera. Y ahí a veces le poníamos nosotros la chapa nuestra.
Un papelito de cuaderno, hoja de cuaderno, y uno le decía, bueno, suponte todo, yo soy Patricia y esto es lo que quiero representar aquí, pero tampoco un nombre completo, nada.
Y nosotros íbamos a checar la arpillera y se la entregamos a una persona allá en la vicaría. Y esa persona tenía que ver si iba en los bolsillos o no iba.
Claro. Es que me da la impresión que ella, porque cada vez que había que hacer algún cambio era porque sugerencia que le hacían de afuera. no, que ahora la vamos a enmarcar, así no le hagan nada. Entonces yo creo, se me imagina que también mucha gente no entendía lo que nosotros queríamos transmitir. Entonces era, claro, los gringos, sí, pues. Así que lo mejor era el bolsillo, o sea, contar la historia.
Quedaba el bolsito puesto. Y después se doblaba un pedazo de, pongámosle que este sea el papel.
¿Y este cuándo lo hicieron ahí?
Nuestro diario, pues, y se ponía aquí.
Pero yo digo, a lo mejor siempre fui un poco rebelde, no, más que un poco, porque yo decía, no, si la historia tiene que contarse aquí, como uno la está viviendo, no lo que después es diferente, pensaba yo, bordarla a escribirla.
Yo empecé a bordar el año 78 en la agrupación de detenidos desaparecidos, de donde yo soy parte. Me invitaron a un taller. Yo tengo a mi esposo detenido desaparecido desde el año 1973, el 6 de octubre. Él se llama Raúl San Martín Barrera. Alrededor de una mesa juntábamos las telas que teníamos en la casa, los restos, inclusive ropa de nuestros mismos familiares, y la poníamos al medio de la mesa, y ahí nosotros íbamos sacando, y íbamos cortando, y íbamos creando en esas telas la vivencia que teníamos diaria. Era lo que nos pasaba a diario. Era el problema de nuestros detenidos desaparecidos, nuestras salidas callejeras, eran las huelgas de hambre.
Yo empecé en el 74, a fines del 74, a principios del 75. En la becadía, las personas que estaban en ese tiempo no querían que nosotros hiciéramos arpilleras.
Porque ustedes se suponía que tenían otra fuente de trabajo.
La lavandería, pero allá en la lavandería ya la gente ya no mandaban a lavar. Se perdió mucho lavar, entonces nosotros teníamos un taller de la lavandería, que estaba en la capilla de Espíritu Santo. Y ya con el tiempo hasta que se ganó la batalla. Y ahí seguimos, y empezamos a hacer arpilleras. Y ahí nacieron los talleres, porque no son el único taller. Primero fue el de los Arpilleras y después de ahí empezaron a hacer todos los del sector.
Rápidamente se proliferaron dentro de la población chilena, te fijas, para el sur, para el norte, y se hicieron talleres en todas partes, porque yo creo que se veía varias cosas. La necesidad de hacer denuncias era muy importante para nosotros, y la necesidad también económica, que nos significaba que a nosotros nos daban un cierto reembolso económico, que nos servía bastante, te digo, en ese minuto.
Yo le decía a mi mamá, pucha, no tengo plata para comprar pan. Hacer pillera, me decía. No tenía otra visión fuera de que con eso todo lo que yo estaba haciendo era para comprar cosas para comer. Hasta que una vez me acuerdo que fui a la vicaría y ahí habían familiares detenidos desaparecidos y bueno, me empezaron a contar sus historias. Había una compañera que se llamaba María Teresa, que yo siempre me voy a acordar de ella porque ella fue la que me enseñó. Yo creo que más que enseñarme a bordar, me enseñó a ver, a conocer las arpilleras, a sentir las arpilleras. Fue un sufrimiento aprender, pero cuando entendí lo que ella quería enseñar, lo quería que yo aprendiera, me enamoré. Fue diferente, fue muy diferente. A través de la arpillera también nos organizábamos, salíamos a hacer actividades a la calle. Era nuestra seguridad porque nosotros podíamos conversar libremente, contar nuestras cosas mientras nos podíamos juntar.
El lenguaje de la arpillera es un lenguaje cercano para mí. Memoria permanente, memoria viva. La arpillera ha significado buscar en esos años tan oscuros, que son los años de la dictadura militar. Me ha permitido encontrar esperanza, creatividad, mucha lucha. Es una enseñanza muy grande para la cotidianidad, como en esta nueva dictadura que estamos ahora en Chile. Las arpilleras, uno vuelve a las arpilleras y uno siempre va a volver a que hay que insistir y no hay que conformarse con lo que hay, sino que hay que buscar.
El año 80 por primera vez la Junta decide establecer una nueva constitución en el país. Y esa nueva constitución generó un revuelo muy importante en todo el país, antes. ¿Ya? Y eso generó también mucha actividad política en contra de esa nueva constitución, de la manera como se estaba implementando en la ciudad y en el país. Entonces había mucha represión y había mucho movimiento de las Fuerzas Armadas, de militares, carabineros, para desarticular esas expresiones de rechazo. En esas circunstancias caigo detenido. Tanto ya en la cárcel, nosotros teníamos un programa así de trabajo, de diario. Entonces la rutina partía en la mañana haciendo actividades físicas, recreativas, deportivas, pero siempre después del almuerzo eran momentos que nosotros nos sentábamos a trabajar y esperar, digamos, por largas horas. Ese era nuestro punto de encuentro. No todos los presos políticos trabajaban en la arpillera, pero los que estábamos ahí nos permitía intercambiar ideas, propuestas, buscábamos mucha poesía, porque gran parte de lo que nosotros hacíamos estaba ligado con textos poéticos de aquellos años.
Pidieron un cargamento de arpilleras que iban al extranjero, entonces ya fueron clandestinas. Ahí cambió todo.
Ya no pudimos hacer más bolsitas ni...
Claro, tuvimos que hacerlas escondidas, teníamos que estar cada uno en su casa, cosíamos en la noche, escondiendo las arpilleras cuando allanaban.
Una vez yo escuché a una señora decir que ella iba con la arpillera en la cartera, en la micro, pero como que tenía... O sea, ella llevaba la revolución en su cartera.
Había algo de que a veces hasta los hijos denunciaban a los padres.
Sí.
Entonces ni siquiera los hijos nuestros podían...
saber que nosotros estábamos haciendo arpilleras.
Claro.
Porque yo tenía que esperar que se cortaran todas mis crías para pues yo sentarme o a mi pieza, a mi dormitorio, ponerme a coser. Porque nosotros realmente éramos extremistas, porque estábamos haciendo arpilleras. Desde el mismo Pinochet lo llamó subversiva. Entonces llegó el momento que yo, fuera de la cortina que tenía puesta en mi ventana, y tenía que poner otra cuestión más.
Claro. Pero los vecinos igual, o sea, había mucho temor de que los vecinos de repente pudieran decir algo. Entonces uno tenía que hacerlo como bien.
Claro, pues yo tuve una vecina acá que me amenazó con echarme los milicos en ese tiempo. Porque supo que yo hacía arpilleras, que las arpilleras eran... Todo se trataba de denunciar lo que estaba pasando aquí, porque prácticamente que la arpillera de los 8 era un diario de vida, que los cortaban la luz, que los cortaban el agua, en el consultorio a veces no había leche, no había T8, las viviendas, esta que después se empezó a surgir después del 80. Entonces todo eso había que... Por eso la gente de los otros países, bueno, la gente que se fueron de aquí, supieron qué era lo que estaba pasando acá.
La parte de atrás de las arpilleras es como si no pudiéramos evadir nuestra memoria. Para mí ese es el significado profundo de los reversos. El reverso es todo lo que no se puede escapar del presente. Si omito el reverso, yo estoy queriendo construir una memoria que no haga problemas, porque es solo el derecho. Pero el reverso son los conflictos, las complejidades. El reverso es todo eso que no se puede ocultar, pero que tampoco se puede decir, porque es reverso, es huella, mancha, son como heridas, son como suturas también, son constelaciones. Y es la resistencia a no darle placer a la memoria oficial. Las arpilleras llevan mucho tiempo siendo tratadas como el arte menor. Y creo que eso es una falta de respeto al trabajo de todas las mujeres que hay detrás de las arpilleras. Entonces, si no mostramos el revés, no mostramos nuestra memoria tal cual es, dolorosa, no es pareja, es salir de esta impostura, de esta idea de memoria oficial que queda muy bien en el museo, pero que no queda muy bien en la vida.
Yo cuando me vine a Suecia fue el año 86, después de que yo estuve detenida en Chile, en el sur de Chile, después de una larga detención, de haber tenido que dejar a mis hijas de 1 año y la otra de 2 años solita, porque me obligaron, o sea, me tomaron y me relegaron al sur de Chile. Volvimos el año 86 para el atentado de Pinochet. Nosotros recibimos muchos problemas en mi casa. Así que la Vicaría de la Solidaridad optó por ofrecerme asilo político y en Suecia.
Durante los años 80, masivas protestas de los distintos sectores sociales del país obligan al gobierno militar a realizar el plebiscito del 88, que termina por devolver la democracia a Chile. Una democracia cuestionable que no ofreció la reparación necesaria a los horrores vividos y que continúa ejerciendo los principios del neoliberalismo impartidos por los Chicago Boys.
En el año 90 se cerró la vicaría cuando llegó la democracia y quedó la Fundación Solidaridad. Entonces ahí ya tuvimos que competir con tiendas, digamos, ya no era solidario. Y empezamos a comprar telas, vino una niña, todo nuevo, lana, que antes era todo reciclado. Y ahí, bueno, ahí también se fue mucha gente porque ya no era lo mismo. Al final fue quedando la buena coordinadora, que éramos de diferentes talleres, éramos 2 integrantes de cada taller, y que estuvimos mucho tiempo así hasta que al final se fue disolviendo hasta que quedó la pura María.
Y estoy así, ¿no?
Claro.
Sí, mi esta la pillera.
Yo no estudié, yo no soy artista, yo soy una luchadora social, una persona que defiende los derechos humanos, eso soy yo, ¿ya? Pero entonces yo necesito también, como persona, poder escribir lo que yo viví y lo que yo viví, la experiencia mía. Porque con eso yo también estoy legitimando a toda esa gente anónima que hizo unas maravillosas arpilleras y que no se sabe ni siquiera que la hicieron ellos. Por ejemplo, en la agrupación de familiares de detenidos desaparecidos, había una mujer que era pero extraordinaria, se llamaba Violeta Morales. Ella buscaba a su hermano detenido desaparecido. Ella era la maestra, era la mejor artillerista que tenía la agrupación de familiares de detenidos desaparecidos. No se habla mucho de ella, de su obra. Se habla de la persona que tomó esas arpilleras, que se apropió. Por eso que estoy decidiendo escribir un libro sobre esto.
Tú no puedes seguir alabando o haciendo alabanza al anonimato hoy. Porque hoy en día no tiene por qué ser anonimato, hoy en día tendríamos que estar en otro proceso cultural en torno a la arpillera. Pero yo creo que a los poderosos les conviene que sean anónimas y que sean mujeres pobres, anónimas, sin voz. Y ellas tienen voz, no son anónimas. Y son protagonistas de un proceso histórico súper importante que todavía es una deuda, porque los cuerpos todavía no aparecen.
Es una forma de sanación, de expresión, de lenguaje, de cultura. Es anticolonial porque no responde a un sistema productivo mercantil que necesita que todo sea rápido o masivo. Requiere tiempo y conexión con el tiempo y el espacio. Los tintes y los colores nos conectan con un territorio y el bordar colectivamente nos conecta entre nosotras y se generan hilos y tramas que crean una urdimbre.
Surge de la necesidad de juntarnos y generar redes de amistad y apoyo entre nosotras. No solo nos une un oficio o la amistad, sino más bien nuestra historia ancestral.
Así también partió la iniciativa de bordar un lienzo de protesta social para el día 8 de marzo. ¡Arriba el feminismo que va a vencer, que va a vencer! Hicimos un lienzo con retazos, los cosimos y luego bordamos 2 lienzos. Y así se ha formado el colectivo, así resistimos desde el lugar más austral del mundo. Tenemos algo que decir y lo usamos con la técnica que nos enseñó la abuela, la técnica que nos enseñó la mamá.
Nosotras bordamos nuestros sentires y los sacamos al espacio público, que es algo que no se espera, porque el bordado siempre fue visto como algo frágil que debía hacerse en silencio, pues tradicionalmente pertenecía al espacio doméstico y estaba asociado a algo decorativo que no conflictuara. También se subvierten los roles de género que se imponen en los colegios, donde se impone la idea de un bordado estéticamente perfecto. Pero nosotras no estamos bajo esos parámetros de belleza impuestos, ni por la técnica que utilizamos, porque creemos que la expresión no tiene reglas.
En octubre del 2019 salimos a la calle nuevamente unidos exigiendo dignidad y con la convicción de sepultar el sistema neoliberal impuesto por los Chicago Boys en dictadura.
Okay, thank you very much.
Wow, that was amazingly powerful, an amazing, amazing thing. So I do have some questions in the Q&A, and I am going to start at the top because I think I think a number of us need to catch our breath after Soledad's video, which is just so powerful. So Lyssa, your paper shows lovely attention to detail, but the union of the crowns took place in 1603. Scotland and England both remained autonomous until the Act of Union in 1707. And so this is, I used to live in Scotland, right? So this is somebody saying that you're using the term United Kingdom and anachronistically, right?
Yeah, I realized after I said 1503 that I should have said 1603. Apologies, everybody. There's no way that James I was on the throne in 1503. And I think this comment came from Penelope Dransart, and thanks for pointing out the issue about referring to the United Kingdom earlier than the 18th century. I'll keep an eye on that and try and get my references a little more dialed in. Yeah.
And so another question for you, Lyssa, is that is about the spangles that are scattered over the pillow. And this is from Suzanne. And she asked whether that polka dot pattern is common to Stumpwork.
Yeah, it is actually quite common. Stumpwork and other 17th century embroideries, whether raised or not, the use of spangles consistently scattered across the ground is very popular. The more bling, the better with these textiles. And when you look at them, you have to picture they're silver, those spangles. And so the whole pillow would have just glittered in the light. And one of the things I didn't show you, since I really didn't have the time to talk about materials and techniques, is that all the way around the cushion is lace made out of silver wrapped thread, and suspended on that lace are hand-cut silver sequins. So it's not just the spangles on the surface of the cushion, but also sequins all the way around the edges. It's pretty spectacular.
Yeah, amazing. So the next question is for Andrea. And they're asking whether you've looked at similar representations of botanical illustrations in chintz prints.
I'm kind of looking at the whole conglomerate. There definitely are a lot of plants represented in chintz, and some people have worked on this. I have, it's one of those rabbit holes, which I really love going down, but I'm trying not to get too bogged down in that. I am finding that embroidery really falls out of the cracks of this discussion between women's work and the emerging science of botany. This tends to have been largely worked on by people who have literary backgrounds, and so they kind of go right to the literature and the poetry. But I'm sure you can find more stuff by looking at chintz.
Yeah. So someone else says that she's never heard of overmantles before. Do you have any recommendations for books or articles on them? I suppose they have to wait for your book, but
which I'm still shopping for a publisher. And I need to finish it. But well, Betty Ring's book, Girlhood Embroidery still is kind of the Bible. I have some issues with that term when applied to overmantles, and this maybe gets at the next question. These women are by and large 18 to about 24, so they're not girls. Certainly Pam Parmel's book on Boston embroidery. So the embroideries, the overmantles tend to turn up in larger studies of embroidery, but samplers have really been the target of a lot more scholarship, partly because they're more numerous, partly because they have text. They often have people's names on them, which most of the overmantles do not.
So Suzanne, this one is for you. Someone is giving you another example of a sampler which incorporates a political slogan supporting Martin Van Buren into the text. And so do you want to make any comment, or are you able to comment on the fact that political iconography crossed different types of textiles and different types of making?
I have not studied that specifically because I've just been working on this one whitework quilt, but I'm sure it does. Yeah, I'm sure it shows up many places because I think that's the only avenue open at that time for women to have a voice. So I think they used, just like Soledad's piece, they are using what they have at hand to make their feelings known.
Right.
I see her reference, so I will copy that down. I'd love to look at that one.
Yeah. So you can get into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and there's a reference there. So this one goes back to the so-called stump work or raised work embroidery. Have you been able to establish a connection between the stump work embroidery and an English girls' school?
Thanks. Okay, I have not, but other scholars have. You can look at The Subversive Stitch by Rosika Parker. She discusses at least one young woman whose father ran a girls' school. And I believe that Kathleen Staples, in her chapter in Betwixt Art and Nature, the Metropolitan Museum of Art's publication on their 17th century embroidery collections, also gives some biographical information on young women who produced either stump work or other embroidery of the time that were associated with schools.
So here is a couple of comments for Soledad. How do you resolve your activist participation from afar in your work? How do you process your physical distance with the events that are happening now in South America?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it happened to be that it kind of was a good thing. Not that it is a good thing, but all my friends were out in the streets protesting every day. And so when COVID happened, everyone had to go inside. And then we were able to have these conversations online. I think that it's been really hard being a person who was born in exile, but then I went back to Chile. I did university there, and then I came back. And understanding what was my role there. And so I think I need to understand the privilege that I have being here in North America and just like go into all the archives that we don't have because they were burned because of the dictatorship. And just trying to open the doors for people that have been silenced by history. Yeah, thank you.
And so there's another one for you too. And so Brenda is asking, how have women in Chile come out of anonymity? Has it been possible under the current regime, or how has this changed in the past few years?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I feel like there has really been a big push for listening to our memory. I feel like what happened in Chile was that we went through a regime of shock, right? And then our parents were really scared to talk about it, but our grandparents had been tortured and so on and so forth. And so for us to recover that anonymity and in a safe space like here, I feel like we are really taking that on. And then there's the other thing about colectivas. Colectivas, we are a colectiva, you know, like it's not one name that goes into the piece. So there's not that much emphasis into the singularity, because I feel like that's something that comes from neoliberalism a lot, to compete and like to be like this one singular person and all that. But we do want to look back and celebrate the women that made these arpilleras and that their names are not there because they were silenced by a dictatorship. So it's kind of a balance of two things.
Yeah, great. Suzanne, somebody's asking you what loom is behind you.
I just saw that. It's a baby wolf. And it does have a warp on it, but I haven't been able to work on it while I do this research.
So you haven't started weaving?
Not back yet.
Looks colorful. Soledad, here's another one for you. Could you speak a bit about your Resign Piñera banner behind you? The banner behind you? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. It says Renuncia Piñera, which is for him to quit, but he didn't, and he still doesn't. So it's going to stay there. And it's just asking the president to step down. And I took this one to the streets. So that's another thing that we were like talking about between us, how the arpilleras have made it so much bigger now because we have to take them to the streets, right? They're but that one took me 2 years to make. So it wasn't exactly made for that. I put the Renuncia Piñera on top of it like 2 weeks before, but the rest, the background took me a really long time to make. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. Suzanne, is there a relationship between the Tennessee white quilts and the whole cloth quilts of Durham and or Wales?
I don't know. I have not studied that at all. I would like to do more research in that avenue, but I still have on-site work I could do on this particular whitework quilt after everything opens back up, you know, and we can actually go into archives ourselves, because I find that those resources are excellent, and you don't know what you're going to find in it. And as good as our archivists and librarians are, and I praise them every day for what help they give me, being on site is a different thing. So, but that's an interesting question. I think I will write that down as an aside to look into, or one of those rabbit holes to jump in.
Yeah. Some of them are very deep, aren't they?
Some of them are very deep.
Yeah. Soledad, here's another one. The Arpilleras look amazing. Is there an online repository where we can see them that is controlled by the embroiderers themselves?
No, yes and no. Everything is happening on Instagram. So there is so much arpilleras coming out of Instagram. Actually, unfortunately I couldn't show all the video, but all of the more contemporary things were gonna come now after when we talked about the revolt of 2019. But yeah, I have so much. I just want to make like a post and tag everyone in there, and then so that y'all can see their work, because it's literally hundreds of people putting out like everyday works of feminist embroidered works. So yeah, there are too many to name them really.
Right, but clearly there's a demand from the participants here to see more of them.
Yeah, for sure. I can leave a list if you want with someone or something like that. If you
yeah. If you send it to me, I can ensure that it gets to the right people.
Okay, sounds great.
Yeah. So this is another question for Suzanne. Does the presence of Masonic symbols help date the coverlet, assuming they represent her husband's membership? Would that help date the piece to after her marriage?
Possibly. When we first saw the quilt, we did ask several people who were Masons in the area, did these represent Masonic symbols? And they said, no, that's not it. And so I did a lot of online research as far as Masonic symbolism and books and looking at Oddfellows and all of this. And I think maybe that the symbolism might have changed. And so maybe they don't really recognize what others used, or perhaps there's different areas. I don't know. The Masons have historically been very quiet about what their fraternal organization is about. And so I've got to find somebody that'll be a little bit more forthcoming and point me to some sources probably. But I think it would help date it possibly.
Yeah. Okay, here's another one for you, Soledad. It's somebody says that your video shows two distinct generations of women using these textiles in protests, so from the 1970s and the 2010s. And they're asking whether there's a dialogue between these generations, sharing of skills. Have you spoken to the older generations about how the younger women are using textiles in protests now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we did, and Amaranta, who's my partner in this, it's Lula, me, and Amaranta. Amaranta actually was taught by the women from Lo Hermida. And so they do workshops all the time. And myself, so I was born in Edmonton in Canada, but I was born in the Chilean co-op. And so I would see, and they would teach me how to make arpilleras, but at the time I didn't understand that I was learning how to make arpilleras. I was like, oh, nice, I can make a little doll, little things like that. And so I learned when I was very young. And I think we all learned from our family and our grandmas and mothers and stuff like that. Or I also wanted to show something that isn't really said a lot, and it's that men also practiced it in prisons, like political prisoners. And yeah, there's a lot of conversation, especially going on right now, and just trying to recover the memory, because there was a time from 1991 until now that democracy came back, that Chileans were just kind of recovering from a shock, but also really trying to just live, you know what I mean? Inside of capitalism, and everything just went a little bit quiet, even though there was a lot happening, but it wasn't the big boom that happened today or last year. And so everything is being recovered. There's new things coming out, and me being outside, it's a big part. So if anyone finds anything about Chile or Arpilleras or anything, send them my way, because my people need it. We really don't have it. So I just put that out there.
And so here's another question. Before Piñera, was there a regrowing of Arpilleras, or has this movement become stronger since the current regime? And so people seem to be really fascinated with this research.
Yeah, there is a resurge of embroidering and arpilleras, and we really don't. Arpilleras, the direct translation is Ute. So if it's not on Ute, we call them embroideries or something like that. There is a really big renaissance of feminism as well. Since Piñera's been there, it was kind of like when Trump showed up, and then there was 8M. There was an 8M in Chile as well. That coincide also with like voting for abortion and things like that. So it was a huge momentum that because the repression of the Catholic Church is really big too. And so it was like huge. It was a giant wave of women without their like tops on and like, you know, like marching through the city. So there's been a huge revival, yes. And I really want to share them with y'all. And I'll pass you all the names.
Yeah, and so someone has just put something in the chat about how they can contact you. All of the speakers' contact information is given in the program, so you can look them up in the program, and there are email addresses there. Soledad, will there be a public presentation of your full video?
Yes. So the idea, everything happened because of TSA. So I'm thankful for just throwing that out there. But then it got so big that it ended up being like a semi-documentary. But we did it all by Skype interviews. We asked people to send us like WhatsApp, like little recordings and stuff like that. And so the sound has been really challenging. So, and also I didn't want to make it so heavy so it didn't lag. And so I'm just doing all the sound stuff. And then after that is going to go onto a page called www.lapartedeatras.com. And you're going to be able to see it as many times as you want, to share it as many times as you want to. It's going to be an open source thing.
Okay, great. So Suzanne, Lynn Anderson has suggested that you contact Amy Knowl, who was director of collections at the Masonic Museum and Library, and you know, she might be able to give you information about Masonic things. And then somebody has asked Soledad to repeat. Did you put that out on Instagram?
Hi, on Instagram. Well, my Instagram is Sol_TELA. And it will be posted to Instagram and to several other Instagram pages of embroiderers in Chile. I think that's the channel of distribution that everyone is using right now in Chile. Even with all the atrocities that are happening, it's been a really good alternative media source for us.
Great. And then the last one that I have here is Soledad. Could you speak a little bit about the relationship between your metal weaving and the more traditional Arpilleras?
Yeah. So I use copper because I'm from Chile, and I really want to, I guess, change the world and like help my people, you know? And so copper symbolizes the nationalization of copper, and it also is where my grandfather was taken from, because he was a miner in Rancagua when he was taken as a political prisoner, and then terrible things happened to him. And so there's always that thread of resistance and of my history and of my embodiment of this history and of being born in exile. Like I can't say, they're like, where are you from? And I have to say I was born from like a dictatorship, you know what I mean? Like it's just kind of what comes out of me and what's coming out of all of the Chileans in my situation right now, that as kids that our parents went through such terrible things.
Yeah, right. That was the last of the questions that I saw, but do any of our speakers have questions for each other?
I have a question for Lyssa. And I was, of course, very interested in your butterflies and moths and things. But some of those, and you can see from my slides that I worked with the entomologists in our bio department, because this very quickly got into I have no idea what I'm looking at. But I'm wondering if some of those things aren't actually moths.
Yeah, they're, it's interesting. It's what I said too initially, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of effort to distinguish between moths and butterflies in the literature. And I'm not sure, you know, when we're talking about the symbolism of the caterpillar and turning into the butterfly representing the restoration of the monarchy, I'm not sure necessarily relevant whether it's a moth or a butterfly, but I have had the same question. And it's interesting that in looking at all of these 17th century and some earlier embroideries, I've never seen anything that I really think looks like a butterfly. They all, to me, look like moths. So it's a really good question, and as you say, more of an entomological question than I got into in my research. Yeah. I have a question for you too, Andrea. Are you still looking at North American textiles that incorporate insects and butterflies?
So this is the chapter of the book that's not finished. So, and I was supposed to go and do a bunch of research this summer, but you know.
Yes, I know.
One of the things, so this, let's see, long story short, I started digging, when I first started digging into the fishing lady embroideries, my first question was, what relationship does this motif have to do with real fish and real fishing? And so in some ways, this is really an extension of that work. I've been looking at these overmantles, partly because they're large and they have a lot of stuff in them, and also because they're made by, you know, adult women, the question of intentionality is less problematic. But I've been looking at the species. I've been really taking, in some sense, a kind of a brute force approach to this. Like, what are those trees? What is that fruit? What are those cows? What are those sheep? And so the butterflies in Mary Pickering's embroidery struck me right away because they are so precise and neat. I couldn't show it, but a lot of the insects, because I didn't have time to get permissions, a lot of the insects are really quite fanciful. You see things they're supposed to look like, clearly based on dragonflies, but they have these weird butterfly-like wings, and they have too many segments in the abdomen, and they're very curvy, whereas real dragonflies are pretty straight. So I'm interested in this interplay between the kind of documentary approach that Mary Pickering takes versus a kind of much more imaginative, kind of fanciful approach, because I think these embroideries, they're like the novel, they're like novels, which is also developing in this period. It has 1 foot in reality and 1 foot in the imagination. And so the embroideries, I think the embroideries tend to go back, I don't want to say go back and forth, but they get their little roots and their tendrils into these areas.
I think the contrast between the 17th century English embroideries and your later 18th, 19th century, are they 18th or 19th?
18th. They're right there in the 1740 to 1770. They kind of stop real fast when as we're heading into war for very obvious reasons. It's too dangerous to send your daughter to Boston to go to school. And then after the war, it's like there's this big, everything suddenly becomes this very neoclassical. It's all silk. It's a lot of it's silk on silk and so forth. So this form really dies very abruptly.
Well, so 100 years later, and it's an interesting contrast because in the 17th century English embroideries, those patterns are taken from these pattern books. And it would be really interesting to examine whether or not any of these women are observing nature and applying it to their embroidery versus this interesting sort of cut and paste from a sample book that seems to be what's happening.
I think if you look closely, you'll find that some of them are not necessarily all cut and paste. I mean, I think the similarity of motifs is what, and obviously there's some repetition, but it tends to, I think for 20th and 21st century audiences, it tends to foreclose that issue of what else is happening.
Yeah, for a lot of the patterns, you can actually match them up to extant design books. So, but it would be really interesting. We do have, there's a 17th century embroidered box also in the Cotsen collection, and it's unique because there's actually a 3-dimensional garden in it with little embroidered strawberries.
Ooh, we need to talk by email.
Yeah, and
we could go on, I guess.
You need to talk after this because we've just run out of time. Great. So I want to thank all of the speakers, and I want to thank all of the participants who came to hear them. And I think that this was just a really wonderful, wonderful panel. So thank you all very, very, very much.